Well, a big warm welcome to Keystone fans across the world. My name is Will Ewing. I founded Keystone and I direct it now. And I'm here with Rory. I went through the Oxford interview process about 14 or 15 years ago, so feel a little bit far removed from it, even though I've been preparing students for a long time. Rory, do you want to just say a few words of background about yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I was at sixth form in Stratford-upon-Avon and then applied to Oxford sort of at the tail end of 2013 and then started at Lincoln College there in 2014 reading English. Yeah.
And you're now one of our full-time professional tutors?
Yes, so I joined Keystone sort of at the end of August and I've been working here since as a full-time tutor. Yeah.
Fantastic. We're about a month out before the interviews. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that home straight well yourself?
Yes, I think it's obviously quite an intense period of time and I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the correct way to go about it. Mm-hmm. But I would say the best bit of advice I can give in sort of the final run-up to the interview is to definitely go over the personal statement, kind of make sure that you have a good knowledge of everything that you've mentioned on there. And if you've got time, reread stuff. So that's obviously a lot easier for poetry than a novel. But maybe just kind of remind yourself about the key things that happen in that novel. Make sure you kind of got all that down. And the other kind of main bit of advice is, if possible, I would kind of recommend to check your teacher's recommendation that they sent, because sometimes the teacher might have mentioned something that you've done which they were particularly impressed with, but if you don't see that recommendation and it comes up in your interview, that can throw you. So I had an incident where I'd done for kind of one of the societies at school, done a presentation on the Aldine printing press, which my teacher had mentioned in the recommendation, but I never saw the recommendation.
Right.
And then that cropped up in an interview, and I hadn't thought about it in about a year, so kind of had to suddenly kind of bring something up.
Yeah, that's a great tip, and a lot of students don't actually know that they can access their teacher recommendation.
Yeah.
So definitely a really good recommendation to go and speak to teachers and see what they've said about you, because that might be the basis of the interview.
Yes.
And about the personal statement too, a lot of Oxbridge students bank their personal statement in the summer, so it might begin to feel a bit rusty these days.
Yes.
So really worth looking at that in the final month. How did your reading and your note-taking change in the last month? Did you adapt at all?
Yeah, I think so. In that kind of final month, I think what I tried to do was, because you've got A-levels coming up, you kind of also want to be focused on those at the same time. So what I was trying to do was stay with, well, for English at least, staying with the authors that we've been looking at for A-level, but reading maybe a different novel by that author that wasn't covered in the A-level syllabus. And I found that's kind of, it's a helpful thing to do because it shows that you've independently decided that the A-level course isn't sufficient, it doesn't kind of sate you. But at the same time, you're not just kind of going off and reading random things, you've kind of got some structure about what you're doing as well. So it can be quite easy in an interview process. They might ask you about what you've been doing in A-level, and then you can kind of segue from there into saying, oh, well, I enjoyed this, but I enjoyed it so much that I decided to read so-and-so, which can be quite interesting. So if you've got time, do a little bit of reading around your A-level topic. That can be quite fruitful. And in terms of note-taking, I think the way I enjoyed doing it really was just to noting down any particular interesting phrases from what I was reading and kind of having those to sort of bring up in interview sort of certain ideas or techniques or styles that the writer was using.
Would you try and memorise whole quotes?
I wouldn't really memorise whole quotes, but maybe occasionally maybe the odd sentence or the odd phrase, just as a sort of things that particularly struck me as being interesting. But really, I think in interview they're looking more at how you conceive of an author's ideas. So you don't have to really remember specific things as long as you're remembering kind of the core of a narrative, of a poem, and you're able to discuss how the author is using that ideas. And you're not just regurgitating, you're kind of using your original thought. That is the main thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the bits of practice which is always recommended for Oxbridge students is to get a practice interview.
Yes.
Did you have practice interviews yourself?
Yeah.
And what would you advise students who may not be able to access practice interviews?
Yeah, so with my school, they did. My school very kindly brought in a sort of a third-party team who did practice interviews, but because the interviews were not Oxford specific, they weren't representative of what I later experienced in my interview, because it was a very sort of general, they weren't subject specific interviews, so they were very much sort of general, tell us about what you enjoy doing at school, let's talk about a topical issue, what do you do in your free time, kind of thing, which is really not what the Oxford interview was about. So I didn't really have any practice interviews, but I think if you're able to sort of, at school, if a member of your faculty formerly attended Oxbridge, that might be quite good to talk to them about the process, or go on YouTube, and I think there are some videos of sort of mock interviews, the kind of style that Oxbridge deliver, which would probably be more helpful than a sort of more sort of generous,
aren't they? But what is it about Oxbridge which is so particular? What marks them out from, say, a job interview or some general interview? I
think with the Oxbridge one, they're very much, are you interested in English and can we teach you? So the first one, you kind of get something similar like that everywhere else, but it's almost exclusively focused on in the Oxford interview. So they're not that fussed that you can play grade 8 piano, well, unless you're applying for music, but or that you do karate in your free time. They're not going to talk about that. They just want to talk about what you've been reading and your thoughts on what you've been reading. And then I'd say the other side of it as well is that because Oxbridge is heavily tutorial focused, so in my first year I was having 2 or 3 tutorials each week. The interview is almost a kind of rehearsal for that, and they want to kind of engage in discussion with you and to decide whether or not their teaching style will suit you. So sometimes they're obviously very, very strong candidates that go into these interviews, but they're not a sort of interlocutory learner. And so they decide this university might not actually benefit this person that well because they're not as good as engaging at discussion as they are, sitting and studying on their own. So that's a lot of it as well is compared to some other unis when the interview is kind of to check whether you're suitable for the uni. The Oxford interview or Oxbridge is, are you suitable for a tutorial system?
Yes. Let's say you don't gel with a particular interviewer. Is there a chance that they might still rate you and then send you on to a different college?
Yes. So usually you have, I think for most humanities, you have 2 interviews at your chosen college. And I think quite often, even if one interview, it doesn't go so well with one interviewer, it might go well with the other and that might gel better. But also, I think if there is that kind of discrepancy, and one of your interviewers really believes you have potential, but maybe the college isn't particularly correct for you, they also can pass you on to other colleges. So I know for some of the sciences, especially medicine, it's mandatory that you interview at more than one college. For English, it will usually, I think, in my batch, when I went for interview, there are, I think, 8 of us interviewing for English, and I think two people interviewed at other colleges afterwards. But it's also worth saying that there's no point reading in to whether or not you have a second interview, because there are people who interview elsewhere but get into their original one. There are people that don't get interviews elsewhere and don't get in. Like there's no clear, definite way of saying, oh, you had an interview at a second college, so you're definitely not going to get into a first. I wouldn't read into it too much. But if you, it's just a sign that they think you're definitely good enough to study at Oxford if you have a second one, basically.
Yes. I remember lots of waiting around in the common room to see whether you would be offered interviews elsewhere. And all of us trying to read into what that meant, but always being reassured that it didn't mean all that much.
Exactly.
Talking about the colleges, that brings me on to thinking about research for particular colleges. Did you do much prior research into Lincoln itself? Would you recommend that?
Yeah, so I think it is quite helpful. I mean, maybe at this point, people have already chosen a college. So I don't think there's not much point sort of researching a college in a way that you're going to choose it because you're already there if you're prepping for interview. But it maybe would be worth just looking at the faculty members of your chosen subject at that college. So fortunately, I was in sixth form very interested in John Donne, and the sort of head of English at Lincoln was a sort of world expert on John Donne and had edited his sermons recently. So I kind of focused a lot on John Donne and looked a bit more at some of the other metaphysical poets, so it was Herbert and Fulk Grenville. And then it was even just a matter of, even the night before, I had a book, a sort of really old battered book which my auntie gave me called The Metaphysical Poets, and read a handful of those the night before the interview. Went in, we started talking about Donne, and then the interview asked, so have you read any of Donne's contemporaries? And I just sort of started name dropping some of these poems, and his eyes lit up a bit. Yeah, exactly. So I think the professors will be interested in talking to you about what they're interested in, which doesn't necessarily mean I wouldn't say fawn to them. I don't think there's much point in reading what they've written. Yep. But if one of their interests happens to overlap with one of your interests, it's probably worth trying to exploit that to some extent. Yes, yeah.
And that leads me to quite a good recommendation, which is, as you said, you're interested in Donne. You then had the experience to talk to a world expert on Donne. Yeah. There is a part of the interview which is about taking advantage of that opportunity. Yes. And if you're seen to be enjoying that opportunity of speaking to such an expert, that gives them a very good clue that you're the sort of person who might really benefit from 3 years there. Yeah,
exactly. I think it's it's quite it's intimidating, but it's also very exciting. And I would say it's an interview, and they're asking you questions, but at the same time, they'd enjoy. I think the interviewers enjoy it more if you engage as if it was a tutorial. So I would say don't be afraid to ask a couple of questions. And quite often I think at the end they might give you an opportunity to ask some questions if you have any.
Yeah. Can you remember any of the particular questions you got asked?
Yeah, so I remember, well, I think the most horrible question I was asked was at the end of my second interview, and there was sort of 5 or 6 minutes left, and they kind of turned to me and they're like, oh, well, we're nearly done. Is there anything else you want to talk to us about? And fortunately, I'd kind of the previous week started reading Brideshead Revisited, so that was on my mind, so I brought that up. So I think from that experience, I would say it's always worth having a text which you don't necessarily intend to discuss in the main body of your interview, but as a backup in case they ask that kind of question and you need to sort of pull something out of thin air. Having something that you can just discuss for a few minutes would be really helpful, just in case. Yeah.
That might also be a good time to talk about particular course questions.
Yes.
I always remember being told that if you ask a question which could be easily found out online, that might reflect badly on you that you haven't done your research. But if it's a slightly more technical question about particular parts of the course, that's quite good background questions to have.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, because the course syllabus is always available online, but maybe asking why they've chosen specific authors to focus on over others, that might be quite a kind of lucrative spot to ask about.
Yeah. And, the Oxbridge interviews are sort of feared throughout the world.
Yeah.
How nerve-wracking was it for you? And any tips on trying to minimise that fear and make it something positive and constructive rather than just terrifying?
Yeah, I think it is very nerve-wracking, and the problem is you're also kind of huddled in a mass of a lot of nervous people. That nervous energy kind of feeds off people. But I would say from my experience, and I did some work helping sort of basically chaperoning people when they come to interview last year as well at my college, and speaking to them a bit about the interviews and how they were finding it. And one pattern that I definitely found is that there tends to be one more friendly interview, which quite often is your first one, which I think can be very nice because they make a definite effort to put you at ease. And that kind of one main thing I would say about it is it can be nerve-wracking going in, but they don't want you to be nervous. They want you to do the best you can without something like nerves holding you back, which is unrelated to your ability to discuss your subject.
And they often start by asking one or two icebreaker questions about your journey there, just to try and make you relax.
It's not kind of you going in front of a panel and tell me what you've been reading. It's a lot more informal. You'll just meet kind of in the tutor's office. They're usually kind of very nicely decorated rooms. But so my first interview was really lovely, and I kind of left feeling like it could have gone on for another half an hour, which was really fun. Then the second interview was a bit different. It was a bit more of a grilling. But at that point, I already kind of felt good after the first interview because it had been so conversational and so smooth. So I didn't have the sort of nerves so much. I feel like as long as you kind of engage with the first interview well and try to enjoy the experience, and even if your second one or sort of your next interview is a little bit more difficult, getting that first one out of the way should alleviate your nerves to some extent.
What happens if you get asked just a horrible question or a question that you just have no idea what the answer is?
I mean, that happens all the time, I think. And but I think the point is they don't expect you to reach a correct, definite answer straight away. I think if they ask you a really hard question and you're able to give a sort of pithy one-sentence response, they'd probably think you're a genius. And the idea is that they ask you these hard questions that they know you might not reach the right answer to, but they want to see your thought process and how you try at least to arrive at an answer. So I think if you're asked a question that you don't know the answer to, just take a bit of time. It might kind of feel a bit awkward to have a silence in the interview, but they always encourage you, if you want to just take a minute to think about your answer, that's absolutely fine.
You can even ask them to rephrase the question or to put it in a slightly different way.
Exactly. And just kind of think about it, mull over it a little bit, and then speak out your thought process and how you're approaching that question, because they want to see whether you can think independently and not just regurgitate something. They also want to see that you can engage in a logical train of thought, because that's the kind of people that they want to teach. So questions that you can't answer are actually quite a nice opportunity to show off the way you think. So they're kind of an opportunity rather than a closed door, I would say.
That's a really good way of putting it. And just more generally, can you remember, you said earlier about the sort of huddled mass of stressed people. What do you do when you're not being interviewed? Is there an opportunity to...
it's interesting. I had quite a horrible start because I arrived at sort of 10 p.m. in Oxford on a train. This was before I had an iPhone, so I didn't have Google Maps. I wasn't really sure where I was going. Had like a really lonely dinner in Itsu alone on the Broad Street.
That's what not to do.
That's what not to do. But they're pretty good actually, because they have the interview helpers at every college who usually are sort of second or first year students there, and they will organise activities in the evening. So you maybe go for a film or go out for ice cream, or even like go to the pub if you're sort of over 18 or whatever, which can be quite nice. So you can kind of do that in the day. They provide meals for you in hall. It's quite a sort of exciting opportunity to get to go to a college hall, which is fun. But I think on my first day before my first interview, I didn't really feel like mixing with other people who had already had interviews, so I was just sort of reading a bit in my room. But then after that first interview, you got the first one out of the way, nerves are settled a little. So then I kind of started socialising a bit more with people. And then after my sort of second interview that afternoon, I think there's no point stressing too much about whether you're going to get another one at college. I think just make the most of your time being in Oxford, sort of get to know the other candidates who have also kind of finished their first two, and just kind of enjoy the city while you're there. Because it's quite unlikely that you'll get one at another college. It only happens to a few people in each group. So
So don't stress out too much.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
What did you wear, Rory, for your interview? Can you remember?
I didn't wear a suit. I think it was just more a sort of. I think I probably wore chinos and a shirt or something.
Right. Yeah. Would you recommend trying to go as smart as you can?
Yeah, I think from what they said, it's not a business interview. So unless you're doing PPE, then maybe wear a suit. But otherwise, I think just smart casual is probably about right. Yeah. But at the same time, kind of there's an idea that smart casual is fine, but I don't think they really mind what you're wearing. They're just kind of there for your brain, I guess, not your clothes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much for your time, Rory.
No problem.
Hope that was helpful. We're going to be hoping to run a few more of these interviews over the next few weeks. So any suggested questions or any topics you want us to cover, do get in touch. Thanks very much.
Cheers, thanks.